Inquietação. Inquietação. É só inquietação. É só inquietação. Inquietação. É só inquietação, inquietação.
Há sempre qualquer coisa que está para acontecer.
Inquietação, inquietação. É só inquietação, inquietação. Porque não sei, porque não sei, porque não sei.
Princípio da Inquietação, o podcast para filosofar, porque não sei ainda. Bem-vindo ao Princípio da Inquietação. Hoje no nosso episódio vamos escutar o filósofo alemão e holandês Peter Sloderdjik. Sloterdjik ganhou notoriedade com o seu livro Crítica da Razão Cínica, publicado em 1983, sendo um dos livros filosóficos mais vendidos do século XX. Na palestra que vamos ouvir, ele faz uma abordagem imunológica à questão de saber se é razoável ter medo de fontes de dano e lesão que parecem estar distantes. Telemalignidade e a ação à distância é o título deste episódio. Princípio da Inquietação, o podcast para filosofar, porque não sei ainda.
O Expresso tem uma nova subscrição que lhe dá acesso completo ao The New York Times, com atualidade, jogos, culinária e muito mais. E ainda aos conteúdos exclusivos da SIC Notícias, incluindo o Direto Vertical, a nova e inovadora emissão que se adapta ao seu smartphone. Subscreva em expresso.pt/digital. Expresso. Liberdade para pensar.
The title is a little bit mysterious because what I have to say comes under the title Telemalignity and Actio in Distance. And this is an approach to the question if it is reasonable to be afraid of sources of damage and sources of injury that seem to be far away. Because all that is included in fear is an interpretation of a menace or a threat that is not already present, but will come from far to here. It is one of the defining characteristics of contemporary philosophy that it has learned to mistrust its own claim made from the outset, to be able to ground or to justify itself by means of reason alone, whereby anything that has in some way absorbed Nietzsche's influence and response to his great anti-Platonic experiment can be considered contemporary. The modern constellation is already forming in the endgames of German idealism, be it with Schelling and Schopenhauer, in whose thinking pre-logical and irrational motives, such as the will and the unconscious, were already illuminated. Be it with the young Hegelians, who wanted to converge from theory to practice, convinced as they were that this would finally turn philosophy from its head to its feet. And while the pathos of great theory was that it wanted to draw everything into itself, there's nothing outside the concept. For contemporary thinking, it is becoming more and more evident that theory cannot penetrate itself completely, for it sits or sprouts, as it were, on a ground from which it grows, but which it cannot completely dominate. Nietzsche calls the way of thinking that inquires into what was before reason the genealogical way of thinking. And he came up with the enormously consequential figure, genealogy of morals. Genealogy refers to the concern with origins. It is devoted to the family tree research, above all with the reference to the question of whether something or someone descends from high or low parents or motives. For Nietzsche, the question was whether the aesthetic ideals were based on noble motives or whether they stemmed from the resentment or the vindictiveness of the life that has failed. And we know that the author of the Fröhliche Wissenschaft, the Gay Science, and also Sprach Zarathustra, thus spoke Zarathustra, ascribed an eminent place to resentment in the construction of morality, especially in Christian morality. And later thinkers supplemented the genealogical motives with the archaeological one, although it sometimes remained unclear whether they were talking about ancient excavation sites or modern archives. And when Michel Foucault spoke of the archaeology of knowledge, archéologie du savoir, he did not appear as a field researcher with a spade, rather as a learned archivist who wanted to reveal the conditions under which the things said, the discourses, the ordered and pre-formatted speeches come into existence at all. And in the following, I'd like to present a brief reflection in the spirit of the genealogical and archaeological research alluded to here. And as a starting point, I choose a thesis formulated directly and indirectly by Martin Heidegger in the genealogical style, according to which there is nothing in modern technology that was not previously in metaphysics. And it will be understood that this sentence, far from being merely a bon mot, is not to be understood as a compliment to metaphysics. Rather, it points to the fact that metaphysical thinking was already corrupted by a cognitive will to power, which is why the release of technology from the metaphysical matrix was essentially nothing other but the explicit disclosure of the striving for mastery of nature, as it was already implicitly announced in metaphysics. But here we see that the genealogical argument in Heidegger's mode stopped too early. Then for anyone who risks the assertion that there is nothing in technology that was not previously in metaphysics would have to add from the logic of the thing itself the following sentence: there is nothing in metaphysics that was not previously in magic. Only with the second step does the genealogical maneuver reach its goal, and by grounding technology via the middle link of metaphysics from magic, it provides it with the family tree from which it can really be understood, namely as rationalized, operationalized, success-tested magic, or simply as magic made to. And as far as the definition of magic is concerned, we can content ourselves here with a few elementary patterns that underlie both the scholarly and the popular understanding of the phenomena. We're dealing with magical practices and corresponding ways of thinking when causes and effects are related to each other in other than trivial physical ways, especially through analogical and symbolic and telepathic operations. And the strongest characteristic of the use of magical power is the expectation that the correct casting of a spell will produce a causal added value. And what is more, the fact that magic has been performed according to the rules of the art is demonstrated quite unmistakably just by one phenomenon, that the visible effects exceed the visible causes many times over. The surplus effect is the magic itself. And when inconspicuous actions or deeds have spectacular consequences, the shadow of a supra-biological magnitude emerges in the world. We call it power. And the will to power is to desire to learn magic. The will to will means the resolution, the Entschlossenheit, to practice it to the utmost. And the magician does not only give orders to human beings, he brings also the elements, the stones, the clouds, and the sunrise under his command. And what is called subject in modern philosophy is, first of all, the precarious human individual of earlier times to want it or had to want to become a magician. And this before all because it had to heal himself. And moreover, magical thinking abolishes the difference between similarity and equality. It assumes that similar things have an effect on their own kind, just as in folk medicine it was believed since ancient times that walnuts had a favorable effect on the contents of the human head because of their brain-like shape. And in the magical use of symbols, the experience of similarity between this and that is developed into a sphere of para-causal resonances. Metamorphoses and travesties blossom without limits, until finally, with the beginning of the Enlightenment, the business of metamorphosis could be handed over to poetry. And furthermore, magic thrives on the conviction that it has the power to neutralize distances in space and to make distant things near and near things far, making things appear and making things disappear, prove to be the pragmatic universes in the magical universe. And incidentally, it seems to be a characteristic of the era of magical thinking that the distinction between actions or deeds and events, Ereignisse, has not yet become clear. And as a result, everything that occurs, what happens, what is going on, or what's up, can initially only be conceptualized under the theme of the completed action. A perpetrator or a maker must be added to everything that happens. The strongest trace of this way of thinking can be seen in the biblical Genesis, and it declares that the world as we know it has not simply always been there, but was created in a 6-day operation. And it was created, or rather conjured up, or made appear by a super magician called God, and can therefore, because it is merely an effect of an act or a deed, be cancelled or conjured away in due course. And in the following, I would like to take a closer look at the case of the magical or telepathic effect at a distance, also known as actio in distans, in later non-magical physics, as it leads us to the question of the good and bad reasons for people's fear of dark forces in their environment. As far as the modern concept of actio in distans, action in the distance, is concerned, we can be brief here. It has been completely rationalized since Newton's theory of gravitation. It says no more than that heavy bodies distributed in space act on each other without contact. They attract each other by virtue of their mass. They have no need to charm or to bind each other. And far below this doctrine of general gravitation, however, the impulse to magically reach out towards distant goals has remained virulent throughout the ages. Indeed, one may assume that the history of the mind in post-magical times will continue to be permeated by motives that are rooted in the magical disposition. One could go as far as to claim that the universe of modern technology as a whole is nothing other than the realization of magical options by non-magical means. At the beginning of this realization lies in the Greek concept of the lever, the Hebel, which was called mechane, which gave the Latin term of machina, or Italian machina, which originally meant the cunning, the trick. Hence the epithet polymechanos, which was assigned to the hero Odysseus, the cunning man, or the polytropos, the man of many twists and turns. The study of the mechane effect by ancient engineers marked the beginning of the rationalization of magic. For if magic initially meant using a symbolic or analogous method to produce a large surplus of effects with small causes, ancient mechanics opened up a non-symbolic method that could be used by anyone to move the greater weight with a smaller force. And along this line, the mechanical arts developed explosively on ancient European soil. The master of mechanics also profited enormously from the alliance with the use of fire in metallurgical workshops. There, the wizards became blacksmiths, alchemists, gunsmiths, and rocket builders. And the instrumental use of fire, not the ritualized use as with the Brahmanic Indians, is a source of higher supramechanical added value in the result. And let us now return to the definition of magical action given at the beginning. It is not only based on the discovery of analogies that help thinking to take off, it also lives from the conviction that thoughts or impulses of the will that are carried out here will produce perceptible effects there in any number of distant places. And conversely, this means that everything that happens here can be influenced by distant forces from there and elsewhere. And if my father breaks his leg while walking through the forest, this can only mean that the thought power of a distant sorcerer has sent him damage. And without a counterspell from our side being able to prevent it. And in modern ethnology, one went so far as to say there is no natural death for archaic thinking. This means that people do not die by themselves or by natural reasons. They are always killed from a distance. There is no natural death. In other words, as long as the world and everything that happens in it had to be imagined under the logical pattern of action or the deed, it was inevitable that agencies, centers of will, poles of power, capricious spirits would be assumed everywhere. And the effect that we call the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century began in the first millennium before our own era, when a revolutionary distinction emerged under the impression of the first urban life. Written culture and intercourse with foreigners. And all of a sudden, it was possible to distinguish between deeds or actions and events. And the Greek tragedy was a medium in which the difference was made visible. In the play Nephelai, The Clouds, Aristophanes brings the Sophistocrates on stage to explain to the astonished audience, it is not Zeus, not Jupiter, it is not Zeus who makes the storm, it is the clouds. And the first word of enlightenment is meteorological. But the witchcraft thinking goes on and on. People that surrounded Napoleon used to say, il charmait les ballons et les boulets. He charmed the ballots of guns and rifles. And the effects of first enlightenment are immeasurable. Once, since the difference between deeds actions and events has been impregnated into the human mind. People can escape the spell of the evil will of others. To speak in the language of our culture, if things go well, they can live in peace. And even more, they can die in peace. They can return to God, provided that God himself does not maintain the features of a bad sorcerer, which he does if he sends harm into the distance, also including the distance of time, under the pretension of post-mortal punishment. But moreover, the European Middle Ages created a figure that relieves God from direct responsibility for events in the mortal sphere. By the no means merely allegorical figure of death, the grim reaper, der Tod, der Mann mit der Sense, yeah, the grim reaper makes it clear that God does no longer do anything himself, but acts, scholastically speaking, through secondary causes. God acts durch Zweitursachen. As can be seen from the above, there are good reasons to view world history as a whole as a drama in which the radius of damage into the distance has been greatly modified. On the magical side, it turned into a clash of ideologies and civilizations. On the technical side, with the help of modern artillery and the rocket technology of the 20th century, it unfolded into a veritable realization of the earliest form of wish-directed damage spells into the distance. And these observations lead to inevitable conclusions in the field of historical and philosophical anthropology. But ever since the choral song from Antigone, we have heard the phrase that many things are astonishing, dinos, as Sophocles says, but nothing is more astonishing, daimotaton, or more monstrous than human beings. And today, we know that this is not only literally true, but we are even inclined to accuse Socrates of trivializing it, because in the process of civilization, not only has a monster of knowledge evolved, which in a quasi-Kabbalistic way has discovered the secret of his own creation by genetic engineering, another magical monster has taken shape, capable of projecting its destructive intentions across vast distances into the far reaches. And very evil thoughts now take the form of long-range missiles. And interpreters of modern times have often believed that they were telling the truth about the world today when they praised technological advances that have made planet Earth a coherent and resonant world. From the transatlantic cables that allowed continent-to-continent telecommunication from the late 19th century onward, to the systems that led to private telephony, then to collect television, and to optical telescopy. All the more recent precisions have been along the lines of sympathetic magic. They transformed the world into a festival of accessibility. But what the new telepolitical cosmopolitans did not consider enough was the fact that in the shadow of a positive teletechniques, a universe grew up, which I call here the real realm of telemalignancy. The earlier seemingly vanished movement of evil will into the distance, of damage spell, the intensive cursing, the Stabilinic prophecy, have today become quite easy to use technical devices. They are mostly in the service of political systems that combine self-assertion with self-expansion. And don't forget the scene that is currently referred to as the hackers and trolls or descendants of the damage wizards. And the modern members of the guild form the agile arm of general staff of destruction technicians. The telemalignancy has become part of the current definition of reality. Its symbolic name in the time of the nuclear arms race was Mutual Assured Destructions, MAD. And this situation had consolidated itself. We are talking about the era of the so-called Cold War and generalized deterrence. The New Testament threat or announcement of the Last Judgment had become a human-made option for a moment that would still fall within the lifetime of the present. And only apparently did the definition of reality fade into the background with the guarantee of mutual destruction after 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it is only in appearance that the gradual ecological self-destruction of civilization has displaced the nuclear apocalypse from the first place among the dark predictions. In reality, the model of creating reality by firing from afar, as represented by nuclear artillery, has become universally accepted. And precisely because the utmost still seems ruled out or simply forbidden, and because a second Hiroshima is not permitted even in thought experiments, a variety of new excesses can develop at the level of submaximal telemalignancy. And it is by no means a coincidence that Russia's war against the Ukraine began as a more or less conventional ground offensive, but then, due to the energetic resistance of those attacked, turned into air warfare, artillery warfare, missile warfare, and drone warfare. And if you think back to the First and Second World Wars, we will come to the conclusion that both were the incubation period of decidedly technical telemalignancy. And what we are experiencing today with the new type of drone warfare, etc., is merely an extension of the concept that has already been practiced. And the typical American form of warfare, predominantly based on air power, also confirms this finding. The Air Force is flying artillery. That means mobile telemalignancy from above, a spell of damage done from afar. So if you want to understand the meaning of the phrase, there is nothing in technology that was not previously in magic, please refer to the evening news from Ukraine and the current missile dialogue between Israel and Iran, which talk about June 2025. As a concept of telemalignancy, also not without a strong reality content, does not appear in the vocabulary of philosophy, neither classical nor modern. This can be taken as a further indication that reason has presuppositions that have not until now been addressed in it. It shares this embarrassment with the concept of the immune system, which forms a strange gap in the philosophical vocabulary. This is also more dramatic as recent biological theory has made it increasingly clear that life and immune system formation are almost symmetrical phenomena. Whatever lives within the protective ring of an immunizing structure. And what we call life is a sum of symbiotic competitions. It has even been said that life is a successful phase of an organic immune system. And this is one of the greatest achievements of Roman legal thought, that it gave rise to the concept of immunity. It initially meant the unimpeachability of political office holders during their term of office, But it also referred to the rarely granted tax exemption of persons who were regarded as benefactors in the community. And it is one of the boldest metaphors of the modern life sciences that they claimed the legal concept of immunity for biology in order to describe the legitimate and indispensable defense of an organism against various invaders. It corresponds on a biological level to what is called in English self-defense or défense légitime at a legal level. And also both expressions, telemalignity and immunity, do not appear in the vocabulary of traditional philosophy. They must be taken seriously by future thinking of concepts of the first degree. And because what Heidegger called, in an academically neutral tone, being in the world, in the Weltsein, in reality always means being in a space in which one inevitably somehow injures oneself, and in which one must be prepared to be injured and suffer harm or injustice. And therefore world always means both injury space and healing space, or a space of restoration. And against the background of this statement, it becomes important to realize that immune systems really do exist. Their existence proves that injuries are not only expected, but the body's own repairs precede their occurrence. Injuries happen so frequently that the precautions against their consequences are already innate for the time being. So the defense structure anticipate or expect is the expectation of the damage. And biological immune systems later branch into innate and acquired one. And this branching responds to the diversification of environments without touching the symbolic dimension. But the organic immune systems are thus no different from embodied expectations of injury. An immune system is an embodied expectation of injury. And because one cannot live without injuring oneself or to be bleeding, there is blood coagulation. And in contrast, religious and legal systems, analogous to somatic responses to injury, offer also a priori compensations for almost unavoidable damage that arises from being with others. And the awareness of the necessity of symbolic immunization arises simultaneously with the sense of right and wrong in human communities. It is one of the first and strongest intuitions of moral consciousness that suffering suffered unilaterally calls for some form of material or symbolic compensation. And it is no coincidence that the core concept of Roman law, compensation for damages, Schadenersatz, aims at the equivalent of loss and compensation. And the utopia of reparative law is based on the idea that a balance should be struck between damage and reparation, and hence a symbol of the scales and the bandage in front of the eye of Justitia. The Christian-coded conceptual pair of guilt and repentance shifts the equalization to the field of moral suffering. It leads to the concept of atonement as the effort of repairing on a deeper level. However, as soon as the legally irreparable penetrates the mind, the desire for compensation for suffering shifts to the thereafter, to the beyond. Here, God, supreme magician, will have to ensure that the disproportion between cause and effect is not turned completely upside down. He himself had created everything that exists with the mere word, let it be, there be. But never should the effect go further beyond the cause than in this case. But it is utterly unacceptable that the huge effect of an earthly mass murder disappears in the tiny cause of impunity in the world beyond. And as far as existence in the space of telemalignancy is concerned, Nietzsche gave his readers and virtual friends the decisive message: I inoculate you with madness. And the vaccine is the delusional idea of identity, be it national, religious, sexual, or whatever. World events since proves that the unvaccinated are at war with each other, and they send each other messages of telemalignancies, sometimes symbolically by threats, and sometimes physically with bombs. But those vaccinated with madness do not yet really know what to do with their very expensively acquired immunity. The best advice for them would probably be to work on promoting a general herd immunity beyond nations, religions, races, and so on, and all other pretexts of self-exaltation that could not exist without hatred of the near and the distant enemy and the fear of it. Thank you very much.
Este episódio do Princípio da Inquietação foi gravado no ESPANTO, Festival Internacional de Filosofia, e editado pela Uncommon Waves. A identidade sonora é uma interpretação do músico e produtor Pedro Luís da obra Inquietação, da autoria de José Mário Branco, inspirada na versão interpretada pelo grupo A Naifa. A capa é de Tiago Pereira Santos, com fotografia do ESPANTO. A coordenação está a cargo de Joana Beleza e a direção é de João Vieira Pereira. Pode ouvir o Princípio da Inquietação em expresso.pt, na SIC e na SIC Notícias ou na sua plataforma de podcast. Voltamos na próxima semana.